My name is Paddy Ekkekakis. I'm an exercise psychologist. I work at Iowa State University, and I had the great honor of being inducted into the National Academy of Kinesiology in 2019. Today, I would like to take this opportunity to share with you a couple of focal points from my research. I investigate the effects of exercise on the pleasure and displeasure that people feel, especially in response to different intensities of exercise. I call that exercise hedonics. I would like to focus on a couple of points and answer a couple of questions. One is, can we do better in developing exercise prescriptions and physical activity recommendations? And very quickly, I would also like to address the question of, can we do better in bringing exercise and physical activity closer to clinical practice? So I would like to embed this presentation within the theme of the conference, which is social justice. I teach a core course on exercise psychology, and I spend the first couple of weeks in the semester explaining the issue of social justice to my students and where exercise fits into the complicated picture of American healthcare. For example, I show them evidence that the United States spends more as a percentage of GDP on healthcare than any other country, and at the same time receives the least amount of return on its investment in terms of life expectancy, where the United States ranks last among other wealthy countries. I explain the concept of polypharmacy and the fact that Americans are on more chronic prescriptions for medications than any other country. I explain the concept of decommodification, which is the access to healthcare resources independent of personal financial means, an important list on which the United States, again, ranks last. This has some very real consequences. For example, a lot of Americans skip medications because of costs, especially among the uninsured or people with very high medication costs. That percentage is around 50%. And it's not just the drugs, not just the medications. Americans also skip other important medical services, such as preventive healthcare screenings or recommended tests. And all of that translates to some very real consequences in terms of life expectancy. For example, this is a comparison of the top half and the bottom half of income earners at retirement, which made no difference in terms of life expectancy back in 1977, but it makes 5 years worth of difference in life expectancy in 2006. So where exercise fits in, of course, is that it can help close that gap. It can be that equalizer, which is becoming increasingly important within the American healthcare system. So I show my students evidence that the effectiveness of exercise compared to leading classes of medications, such as in this particular example, antihypertensives, can be equally effective. So the question then is, okay, that's the potential. Are Americans taking advantage of this potential by being physically active? Of course, the answer, as we all know, is sadly no. And if you want to put a price tag on this phenomenon, it's been estimated to be, give or take, about $28 billion a year. So that's the social justice context. I told you that I study how people feel in response to exercise of different intensities. And a driving force in my research over the past 40 years has been this statement by Rod Dishman back in 1982, who said that at some point, we will have to reach a grand compromise between the physiological considerations that go into developing exercise prescriptions and the behavioral considerations, because as you can imagine, those might not always coincide. Sadly, 40 years later, we have made absolutely zero progress on that front. As an example of this, you can look at the latest SESM guidelines that still to this day have a completely separate chapter on exercise prescription, written by physiologists, physicians, and epidemiologists, and then a completely different separate chapter in the back of the book on behavioral issues. The ACSM has been clear about this, that in developing exercise prescription guidelines, the experts take into account only two factors. And that is, number one, the dose that maximizes adaptations, and number two, the dose that minimizes risk. What is missing? What is missing is that exercise, of course, is a behavior that people need to undertake on their own free will. And that's where my research comes in, because I have been investigating how people feel when they exercise. And it turns out that it doesn't take much to make people feel worse rather than better with exercise. So here you can see on the left panel, the percentage of individuals within a sample. Each of the markers represents a sample from a different study. The percentage of individuals within a sample that say that they feel better as a function of exercise intensity on the left, and the percentage of individuals who say that they feel worse as a function of exercise intensity on the right. Or to look at it a different way, you can think of the range of exercise intensity in terms of moderate, heavy, and severe domains. And within the moderate domain, we have relative homogeneity in how people respond. Most people respond with increased pleasure. The range of severe intensity, or the other end of the spectrum, we also have homogeneity because most people respond with displeasure. And then in between those two extremes, we have a zone of response variability, with some individuals feeling better and some individuals feeling worse. So I would make the argument that that information would be important to integrate with the physiological considerations that go into developing exercise prescription guidelines, but that has not happened yet. To look at physical activity recommendations, this is the example from the 2018 second edition of the US Federal Physical Activity Guidelines. And you will see a structure that is very similar to other guidelines. The top half of the page explains the rationale for why people should be physically active. And the bottom half of the page has some very specific numerical instructions about how much physical activity people should be doing. I'm not going to comment on the bottom half of the page, whether people can in fact remember all of our very specific numerical instructions. I'm going to focus on the top half of the page, which is that we try to promote physical activity to this day on the basis of the argument, this is good for you, this is something worthwhile that you should be doing. So this is the standard approach in public health. It's called the rational educational approach, and it's the foundation of every public health campaign. The question is whether it works in the case of exercise. Well, this approach is based on the assumption that humans are rational thinking decision makers, that they pay attention to information, they retain the information that you provide them, and then later, when called upon to make decisions about allocating their discretionary time, they will apply this information, use this information in making the right decision. And you can see manifestations of that assumption in every physical activity promotion campaign there ever was. Well, in the United States, nearly everyone says that not being physically active is bad for you. Percentage is estimated to be around 97%. But if you put accelerometers on people and measure their actual physical activity behavior, what you realize is that 97% do less than the recommended amount. So this is a unique case in public health where you have this completely striking contradiction between the percentage of people who are aware of what they should be doing and the percentage of people who are actually doing the recommended behavior. There is nothing else like it. So now for the first time, we are coming into that realization, and this is from the Lancet group on physical activity, who back in 2012 said that our traditional public health approach, which is based on evidence and exhortation, has been unsuccessful so far. So with my colleague, Ralph Brand, we have been proposing this alternative perspective that says that in addition to what we call reflective processes, this rational knowledge, awareness of the benefits as a driving force of human behavior, we should also start considering affective processes, such as, for example, potentially unpleasant past experiences with exercise. And we speculate that in the case of exercise, there might be a conflict between these two processes that explains the current absence of physical activity participation in the population. So I have been advocating for what I call a prime directive in developing exercise prescriptions and physical activity recommendations. If physiological and behavioral considerations happen to be in conflict, I submit that it is the promotion and maintenance of behavior change that should have primacy. So that concludes point one, and to turn to point two, which is whether we can do better in bringing exercise and physical activity closer to clinical practice. As you know, within the framework of evidence-based medicine, different treatments have to undergo a series of steps before they can come to clinical practice. There have to be, for example, multiple randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And then we go to clinical practice guidelines issued by major organizations. And you can then hope that the practitioners, the clinicians, the physicians will follow these guidelines. They will apply these guidelines in their practice. In the case of exercise and physical activity, we have gone through steps 1 through 4, and we are stuck there. And we have not yet moved to step number 5 in most cases. An example of a step 4 is back in 2018, the American Heart Association said that physical activity should be assessed at every visit. And if found to be less than the current guidelines, physical activity should be promoted. As an exercise psychologist, I focus on depression. Physical activity and exercise are not recommended in the United States for the treatment of depression, but in other countries, many countries, they are. And I will draw an example from the UK, where for years now, physical activity has been recommended for the treatment of most cases of depression. But physicians do not bring it up. They're supposed to, but they don't. So there are many different explanations that have been proposed for this phenomenon. One that has not been widely discussed is an anti-exercise movement or lobbying on behalf of the pharmacotherapy industry, the psychotherapy industry, and even the primary care physicians. So we have seen some very interesting phenomena, such as organized mass media campaigns against exercise, or a large number of publications published in medical journals where it is claimed falsely, misleadingly, that there is no evidence for exercise as a treatment of depression, or editorials that openly say physicians should not be recommending physical activity for the treatment of depression. So earlier this year, I published in Kinesiology Review a paper where I examined more closely the reactions of these different lobbies, pharmacotherapy, psychotherapy, primary care physicians. And what I have circled here in red is what is also an interesting phenomenon, which is the complete absence of a kinesiology lobby. So the viewpoint of exercise was never expressed. So what I would like to see in the near future is a more organized effort to contribute, to participate in the development of clinical guidelines from kinesiology-related entities. So on that note, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to be able to share more in the years to come.